Here's what's coming up on episode 44 of the Big Séance podcast. Richard Estep.
It's always been a passion subject for me, and my mom and dad, my grandparents, were very, very good about keeping my bookshelf stocked, and my library card got used to check out books by Harry Price and Peter Underwood and some of the great, not only paranormal investigators, but authors in the field. Sometimes a creaky floorboard is just the house settling. In fact, usually that's what it is. It's not always the footfall of a ghostly figure, and I think a lot of folks don't want to hear that. I think the problem is that when it comes down to paranormal tourism, there is always a pressure when money changes hands to deliver a product. They did not have gadgets, but what they had was a scientific methodology and a keen mindset, and they were observers. They would look at witness testimony, and they would see if they could poke holes in it. They would see if they could explain what was going on in there. The truth is, you don't need a huge budget to be an effective paranormal investigator. I would argue, actually, that the best people to be regarded as experts in this field would be psychologists, would be physicists, would be medical doctors, psychiatrists, because all of these elements come into play in cases of the paranormal, whether real or not. It's undeniable that there are more ghost sightings and paranormal activity reported in the run-up to Halloween than any other time of the year. But I suspect the explanation is more prosaic than that. It's more mundane. I think that ghosts are on our mind.
Welcome to the Big Séance podcast. I'm Patrick Keller of BigSeance.com, and this is a place for an open discussion on all things paranormal, but specifically topics like ghosts and hauntings, paranormal research, spirit communication, psychics and mediums, and life after death. So basically, anything that pops up in my paranormal world. The candles are already lit, so you might as well come on in and join the seance. Hey everybody. Wow. It is already a busy October, isn't it? And the energy and crazy things happening lately, it has just been kind of overwhelming. It makes me think I need to get an astrologer on here sometime. I just know that the month is moving way too fast. I still haven't gotten my Halloween altar assembled or any other decorations up. We are late getting our pumpkins, which is something that is usually done by now. One thing I can't complain about is the beautiful weather that we've had here in Missouri. When the weather turned, it really turned. And I hope I'm not speaking too soon. But for now, it's beginning to look and feel a lot like Halloween. I have some shout outs before we jump into my interview today. Last weekend, I attended a very cool event at the beautiful Bell Fountain Cemetery in St. Louis. It was hosted by the Mourning Society of St. Louis, and that's MOURN. The event was called Consolations of Memory, Death and Mourning in 19th Century America. It was a truly enjoyable, if not a little frigid, afternoon spent in the cemetery. This is the second year that I attended a Mourning Society event. You might remember me talking about this last year when it was held at the DeMenil Mansion in St. Louis. Well, for the second year in a row, I got to see and visit with Ginger Collins Justice, who often works these events. Do you remember her from episode 23? And this year, I also got to meet and talk to Josh, who has been a great friend and supporter of the podcast. And actually, he's the one who brought this year's event to my attention and invited me. So thank you, Josh. It was a good time. I took some photos, but I haven't had the opportunity to really pull them up or look at them yet. But when I do, I'll post them at BigSeance.com at some point. In talking with Ginger at the cemetery, she pointed out that Saturday, October 17th, is Find a Grave's Global Cemetery Meetup. I thought this sounded so cool. If you're a fellow cemetery nerd, and I know there are several of you out there, Here's what it says on the website, which I'll link to the show notes at bigseance.com. Do your part for history. Help preserve your local cemetery. Attend this special event or plan one of your own. Visit a cemetery in need to take photographs and videos of headstones, explore the grounds, and share stories and discoveries with others who want to make a difference. With your thoughtful contributions, history will never be forgotten. So I think a few of us just might make plans to participate. Since I haven't been able to do my traditional grave adoption project this year, this might be a nice alternative. If you do end up participating in the Global Cemetery Meetup, let me know how it went and what you did. One more shout out for this week. Markel left a comment on bigseance.com just today. A really nice comment. She had some very kind words and a suggestion for a guest. You rock, Markel, and I'll see what I can do. Don't forget your homework from last week. Make sure you're subscribed to the Big Seance podcast in iTunes or the podcast app. And find a sneaky way to subscribe your friends to the show as well. And then here's the fun part. Let me know how you did it. Did you forget about that homework? I'm a teacher. You're not going to get away with forgetting that easily. I'll give you a 1-week extension. All right, enough yakking. Here's my interview with Richard Estep.
You're listening to the Big Seance podcast with Patrick Keller. Look for us on iTunes and be sure to check out bigseance.com for more discussion.
Well, paranerds, you wouldn't believe how difficult it has been getting another seasoned paranormal investigator on this show, and today I've done it. With us in the parlor today is Richard Estep, the author of In Search of the Paranormal, The Hammer House Murder, Ghosts of the Clink, and Other Disturbing Investigations that came out this year, 2015. And here's Richard's bio, and this is directly from Amazon. Richard first got involved with paranormal research in 1995 in the UK after attending an overnight investigation at the infamous St. Botolph's Church. He spent the next 5 years investigating the haunted hamlets of Great Britain as a member of Andrew Wright's Leicester-based team. Richard co-founded Boulder County Paranormal Research Society, BCPRS, with his wife Laura in 2006 after relocating to the United States in 1999. He's also a paramedic and a volunteer firefighter. I know he keeps very busy. And this is directly from the book's page in Amazon. From exploring the Tower of London to investigating a haunted Colorado firehouse, paranormal researcher Richard Estep takes you behind the scenes for an up-close and personal encounter with a fascinating legion of hauntings. This collection reveals some of the most chilling, captivating, and weird cases that Richard has investigated over the past 20 years in England and in the United States. In Search of the Paranormal is filled with rich historical detail, present-day research, and compelling eyewitness accounts. You are there with the team at each haunted location, walking through a desecrated graveyard, shivering in a dark basement, getting thrown into the Clink, watching a ghost-lit stage in an old theater, employing a variety of investigative methods, from high-tech gadgets to old-fashioned practices such as dowsing, table tipping, and Ouija boards. Richard Estep and his team uncover the dark mysteries of the paranormal realm. And you can find more, I think, at richardestep.net. Well, greetings, Richard. How are you?
I am doing very well today, Patrick. How are you?
I am good. We talked about kind of being a little frigid today. It's October, and it's definitely suddenly October weather here, and I'm in a blanket, and I'm loving every second of it.
Yeah, it's kind of chilly here too in the Rocky Mountains, in Longmont, Colorado, but reminds me of home. It's good British weather today. The only thing I'm missing is a fireplace and a good book, which I will probably have both of after the interview.
Nice. So if I'm not mistaken, sir, St. Botolph's Church got this whole journey into the paranormal started for you. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, there is a book which I believe is out of print, but don't quote me. It's called Ghostbusters UK, which came out in the 90s. And it was a book written by a paranormal investigator. There were very few at the time either doing it or writing about it. And I would devour every book on that subject that I could find. And there was a very long section on St. Botolph's in the book, which ended with this team. Robin Furman was the guy who ran the team and wrote the book, which ended with Robin's team basically being chased out of the church by some nebulous form they said had risen out of one of the tombs. So that alone sounds, firstly, like a great horror movie, doesn't it? So I thought, I've got to check this place out. And it did nothing for a while afterwards until I heard that a team was looking for volunteers and was going to go investigate that church. And so I said, sign me up. I'll carry bags. I'll make the tea. I'll do anything. But I really would love to go learn the ropes. And so I did. I was lucky enough to get a spot.
And did you have any experiences growing up that were paranormal? I know myself, it's kind of strange that I ended up so fascinated later as an adult. As a child, I didn't really have a lot of experiences.
Experiences, no, but not for a lack of trying. It's always been a passion subject for me. And my mom and dad, my grandparents were very, very good about keeping my bookshelf stocked, and my library card got used to check out books by Harry Price and Peter Underwood and some of the great not only paranormal investigators, but authors in the field. So I'd read pretty much everything there was to read and spent some time growing up in a haunted house that my grandparents owned. Never had any experiences at all, but that was a very cool place. And their generation had told stories and still do of how an old lady had tucked their children into bed at night in several of the bedrooms. You know, it was one of those big families, small house, where you have 3 or 4 kids sleeping to a room, and this ghostly old lady they believe she was a former inhabitant of the house, would come in at night to keep an eye on the children, which they all thought was kind of incredibly cool, and I thought was terrifying because I was sleeping in those rooms alone. And so I would kind of lie there with one eye open at night, and I was half hoping that something would happen and half really hoping that it wouldn't, because I would probably pee my pants. And I never did come face to face with her. It looked like that haunting just kind of dissipated when my stepfather's generation of the family grew up and moved out of the house.
Yeah, I can't exactly tell you for sure what I would have thought growing up, but when I hear people tell cool stories now of either paranormal experiences they had growing up or, and you know, I haven't experienced a lot of paranormal activity at all anyway, but I do get kind of jealous. I'm like, man, why can't that stuff ever happen to me?
It almost seems that the harder you look for it, the more elusive it is.
Right.
And in fact, again, Peter Underwood was very famous for saying that the best way to avoid seeing a ghost is to actively look for one. And I think there's a lot of truth to that.
You have to just stumble upon it, I think.
Well, in kind of the same way that if you've ever been single and looking for a partner, you know, you date, and it can take forever, and then when you're not looking, you know, it can hit you at once. You know what I mean?
That's probably true.
I think it's kind of the similar analogy. But most of the folks I've talked to that have encountered apparitions or have experienced the paranormal didn't set out to do that. They just found themselves in circumstances where it took place.
Mm-hmm. So I wasn't the greatest history student growing up, and there's a lot of history of the U.S. that I need to brush up on. But dear God, I had no idea of the brutal history of the Tower of London. And then, of course, after reading about it, I had to Google it and just stare at the pictures, and you think, really? Like, I had no idea.
Most people don't know when the last deaths in the tower were. Do you have any idea, Patrick?
No, I do not.
Bear in mind that the tower is one of the oldest buildings, I think, in the United Kingdom. And it's been used as the arsenal of Britain. In fact, they used to say, whoever holds the tower holds England. It was the monarch's fortress and armory and jail where they would throw you if you got on the bad side of the king at the time. or the Queen. So down through the years, it's been this place of torture, of brutality, of death, of execution. But the last deaths actually were, I want to say it was in the 70s, when the IRA detonated a bomb in the tower and killed quite a few tourists and visitors to the building. So it's not that far back that people have been dying in the Tower of London, unfortunately.
So sad. You also, I imagine you have a special place in your heart for Hose Company number 3. Can you tell us a little about that?
Hose Company number 3 is the Pueblo Fire Department's museum, and it was their third hose company, what we would now think of as an engine company, as opposed to a ladder company, And it is, for all intents and purposes, an old firehouse, and it is the coolest building I've been in quite some time. It still has the doors where they would take hay in for the horses that would draw the wagons, the fire engines, the original engines that were on carts. So you can still see the doors where the hay was taken in on the block and tackle, and where they were stabled. And it is just a firefighter's treasure trove of antiquities when you go in there. They have pretty much the entire Pueblo Fire Department's history is wrapped up in that building. And if you guys would like to actually see it, well, number one, I recommend that you go if you're within range. But if not, Haunted Collector with John Zaffis did an episode at Engine Hose Company 3. So I want to say, no, I don't know which episode it was, but it's certainly out there and viewable on YouTube. So if you go Google it, you can kind of see inside the place. But it is an old antique firehouse with much of the original furniture, most of the trappings, and it is located, Patrick, how cool is this, next door to a mortuary. So you have a firehouse standing shoulder to shoulder with a mortuary. Across the road is an Irish pub, and just a stone's throw away is the Masonic Lodge.
Buzzing energy from all directions.
Well, and that's before we get to the power lines, which are kind of scarily close to the building itself as well. So EMF levels in that building are very high. And I've spent a number of nights investigating that location.
It reminded me, I was very fortunate. One of the investigations that my team had was in an old firehouse, and I can imagine it's probably much smaller than what you investigated, but you talked about the horses and the back entrance, and there was things hanging from the ceiling that they would use to hang things for the horses, I remember, and they were still hanging, and it was just so very cool to see that.
Well, and you talk about not being a great history student, but I think that history comes most alive when you are steeped in it, when you are able to spend time touching, the fabric of the uniforms that people wore, or you're able to handle the axes and poles and touch the vehicles. When you can connect with history on a physical, tangible level, I think it becomes a lot more fascinating for everybody.
I would agree with that. Sometimes I get distracted by thinking about the historic part of a place when I'm at an investigation. I'm like, oh yeah, I've got a job I'm supposed to be doing right now, but I'm sitting here daydreaming about what it was like, 100 years ago or whatever.
Yeah, when history's written well, it's not a bunch of dry dates. It's about people. It's about causes, motivations, effects. And we forget that they were people like us. They had similar worries, albeit in different form. They had similar concerns, hopes, dreams, loves, passions, and challenges.
Do you have a lot of cool stories from private cases that are undisclosed that maybe you couldn't put it into the book that, might drive you nuts that you can't talk about?
I do have a bunch, and it's not that I can't talk about them because I'm very willing to change the names to protect the innocent, as it were. And I think that's material for future books. If people like In Search of the Paranormal, and it seems to be very well reviewed right now, I'm hoping to put another volume together and talk about some more of those cases. After 20 years in the field, it's not that I lack for them. In fact, it was choosing the cases from my files that was the biggest challenge putting this together.
And something that impresses me with your book and how you write about your experiences is that you don't just slap the reader with your whole library of scariest experiences, leaving us assuming that you have crazy, frightening paranormal experiences everywhere you go. In some of your stories, you've completely explained things away. You've talked about how quiet nights at an investigation where nothing happens, sometimes that's more often than not. And from someone who has done paranormal investigation and has seen some of what it's really like, I love your honesty. And one of those experiences that you write about in the book was the Mackey Auditorium, for example, where it was just completely peaceful.
Well, the Mackey Auditorium at the University of Colorado was the scene of a quite brutal murder and sexual assault, and has since, the so-called haunting of that building has grown to, the legend has grown to epic proportions on campus. And what it is generation after generation of students, especially around October, because I did talk to the campus police, like to get in there and like to try and scare one another, when ghost stories are very prevalent. And it's a real shame because there is a genuine victim here, the poor unfortunate young lady who died, who still has, I assume, family living in the area. And this is a story that we wanted to get to the bottom of it and lance the boil, There is no evidence for there being any paranormal activity there at all. So we went out to try and gather any evidence if it was there. We didn't find any. And I promised the folks that allowed us to investigate the place that we would be very vocal about the fact that we found nothing. And I appreciate you saying what you did about the book. I forget who said that drama is life with all of the boring bits cut out, but that's kind of how a book is. And I know you've investigated yourself, so you'll be aware of the fact that perhaps 80 to 90%, closer to 90% of what we do is kind of tedious. There's a lot of waiting around, isn't there?
Absolutely, yeah.
And so you watch TV and you're watching the edited highlights. So when you watch a TAPS investigation or whatever show, you're seeing what an editor has put together. You're not seeing, if the job has been done right anyway, countless hours of sitting around waiting for something to happen. And so with a book, I didn't want to give an unreal expectation of what this is like. We have a good team at Boulder County Paranormal. When people do leave, it's usually because they arrive with unrealistic expectations of how paranormal research is. They tend to think they're going to get something on every investigation, and it just doesn't work out that way. Sometimes a creaky floorboard is just the house settling. In fact, usually that's what it is. It's not always the footfall of a ghostly figure. And I think a lot of folks don't want to hear that. So I wanted to portray a little realism, a little of what we do in the book, and by including cases where we were able to satisfactorily explain what was going on.
And I really appreciated that. I've never been incredibly specific about why I kind of shifted out of paranormal investigation, and I only did it, for a couple of years, had my team, and I very much enjoyed it, and I learned a lot from it, and I think we helped some people with it too. But one of the reasons was I tend to be an incredibly OCD person, and I'm all about just documenting, and I would spend a month, poring over every little piece of activity and data from just one location. And I tend to let my analytical brain take over sometimes. And something that is completely likely to be paranormal in the back of my head, the skeptic side of me jumps in every time. And it just kind of gets tiring because I've got the other side of my brain that truly wants everything to be paranormal. And I just have this endless fight. And that was one thing that kind of stressed me out, I think. Do you ever go through that fight in your head?
Skeptic is a term that gets a lot of bad press in our community. And it's a term we need to agree on a definition for it. Mm-hmm. Because when we say the word skeptic, we tend to think that this is an unbeliever. They're synonymous. This is someone who, no matter what happens to them, will not believe. And I'm thinking of Agent Scully now, who was abducted by aliens how many times and yet would never, ever believe. Whereas what skepticism really is, it's basically saying, show me the evidence. In what direction does the evidence point? And there comes a certain point where in order to accept a quote unquote rational explanation or a mundane explanation, you have to make so many twists of logic that it no longer makes sense. And I'll give you an example. One of the first cases I ever worked on was a private help case in the UK. And we had a kitchen where the whole house was under control. We had secured the doors and windows, so there was no way anybody could get in. The family was out of the house. There was one back door from the kitchen to the yard, and then one door from the living room to the kitchen. Back door was locked and secured. My team happened to be in the living room, so we were in front of that kitchen door. Nobody was able to get past us into that room. Okay. About an hour after we had secured the kitchen, one of our investigators went in to put the kettle on because caffeine is the fuel of paranormal investigation, as we all know.
It is.
And then let out this kind of exclamation. And so what we found was that the kitchen cutlery drawer had been pulled out and the cutlery had been lined up on the countertop. And when you start looking at that kind of experience and trying to make a logical explanation for it, either you have to convince yourself that somebody with a key, like the family members, was able to open the door from the outside, get through all the seals, which, by the way, were intact, come into the kitchen completely silently. And the outside also, we had motion sensors with lights. So if anybody had been walking around outside, they would have tripped the motion sensors and turned on the lights. Come into the kitchen completely silently, remove cutlery, close the door, left, and somehow retaped the seals on the doors behind them. Now, Harry Houdini couldn't have done that on his best day. Mm-hmm. So what does that leave you with? You know, where is your rational explanation there? And I often wish that some of the truly non-believing individuals that I know, I've been able to take them along on a case like that and to have them try and explain to them, to anybody really, hey, how did this happen? And for me, that investigation was one of those where my worldview changed, because I'd always been very open to the possibility of the paranormal, the supernatural, call it what you will. I'd always been very open to it and kind of a believer. But it's one thing to be, yeah, sure, I think ghosts are real. It's something entirely different to be in a location where it slaps you in the face, not literally, you know, but the facts are right there and they're almost impossible to deny.
And one thing I wish sometimes teams would do, kind of like I think you've laid out in your book, is when you're uncertain, when you haven't really made an official decision and stamped paranormal on it, I wish people wouldn't throw that out because, you know, often, especially with EVP, if they're not sure, a lot of investigators will say, well, if you're not sure, you have to toss it. And I'm like, well, what makes you think, 10 years down the line, or if some other detail pops up later, that, something won't be the other piece to that evidence. So I like the fact that, and I tend to do the same thing. Even if you have, you seem to have, debunked it or whatever, you still kind of lay it out there for people to see.
I'm a big advocate of peer review, and I think that comes from being a medical professional, because when you're going to publish any kind of scientific article or journal or paper, it's peer reviewed, isn't it? In order to make it into a journal. We don't usually have anything to that standard in the paranormal field, and we should start looking for it. So I have several fellow investigators on other teams that I trust, and I will send them evidence and say, hey, what do you make of this? I'm not going to tell you the backstory until you've examined it, but what's your opinion? Do you think we have something here? And there are times they'll say, this is kind of impressive, give me more detail. And there are other times they'll say, I think you're seeing patterns in lens flare. I don't think you have anything. And getting in those objective third parties can be a nice counterbalance to the desire we all have to find evidence of the paranormal.
In doing this show, I've gotten to know and interview quite a few psychics and mediums, and some of those beautiful people are from the UK. I've learned that there are some differences between there and here, particularly when it comes to how psychics and mediums work, how they're accepted, etc. Is the world of paranormal investigation different across the pond as well?
I don't think significantly it is. The big difference that I wrote about when I was putting together In Search of the Paranormal and just reflecting on my career, it's not so much one of geography, the UK versus the US. It's the era. And I was lucky, really, to span two eras. When I first started investigating in the UK, it was pre-Ghost Hunters, pre-Most Haunted. Mm-hmm. Most Haunted is the show that exploded the scene, the paranormal research scene, into the public consciousness in the UK, and Ghost Hunters did it here in the States. Mm-hmm. And so I think that I can't speak to how the American scene was prior to the media explosion because I wasn't here then, but certainly in Britain, it was very much quieter. It was very much less dramatized, and there were certainly many less people doing it. You had to search far and wide for a team to come investigate, whereas now you can't throw a rock in either country without hitting somebody who paid $20 for an EMF meter and they know how to use it.
So since you have spanned 2 decades with this, have we missed the mark in any areas since the paranormal explosion, since the mid-90s? Have we improved? Are there good things going on in the field?
I think we've managed to both improve and regress in different areas. So in terms of improvement, I think we're collecting more data, which is good. And one thing that strikes me, Patrick, is the field of paranormal photography. If you look at how many times your average American or British citizen or European citizen anywhere in the Western world, how many times we're on camera in a given day, it's an incredibly high number, isn't it? Because we have cameras everywhere. And more importantly, perhaps, we all have cameras in our pocket.
Right.
With our smartphones. So the question I keep asking is, where are all the really good ghost photographs? And the problem is, of course, they're out there. And thanks to Photoshop and the fact that there is no longer a negative film to examine, most of them are too good to be true. So that kind of has changed the field, hasn't it? And you also have more and more people investigating than ever before, more people in haunted locations. The flip side of that, though, is it's become kind of a tourism thing. There is definitely a booming industry of ghost tourism, isn't there, where people are paying good money to investigate haunted venues. Quite often you'll see that those folks are influenced by alcohol because it becomes a night out. And I do occasional charity events where we rarely gather any useful data, but we do make money for my favorite charity, the Humane Society, and it's becoming quite a thing. So I think that the data we're gathering is not necessarily as valuable unless we're careful about holding it to a rigorous standard.
And I think, too, I think you're right there. We've talked about that several times on this show where there are cool things going on as far as the kind of the tourism part and keeping some of these places afloat. And there's side effects, too.
I think the problem is that when it comes down to paranormal tourism, there is always a pressure when money changes hands to deliver a product. So if somebody is paying, let's just say $50 to spend a night in a haunted house and they don't find anything, they're going to be disappointed. If you are benefiting financially from that circumstance, you have a vested interest in delivering evidence, don't you?
Sure.
So there are certain haunted hotels, let's not name any names, because lawyers, but there are certain hotels and places like that who make a real trade on their ghosts and would see a real revenue loss if they weren't regarded as haunted venues. So they tend to play up everything. Everything is evident. It's a piece of dust in a camera lens. Nope, it's a ghost. It's a spirit manifestation. So I know a number of police officers as part of my professional activities, and when they're investigating anything, when a cop investigates a crime, they always ask who benefits. And I think it would be a good thing for paranormal investigators to adopt that approach, Patrick. When somebody calls us in, who benefits here? Because what always impresses me is the client that says, look, I have this weird stuff going on at home. It's affecting my family, my kids. We're all scared. Look, can you guys not publicize this? We don't want our names to appear anywhere. We don't want our pictures or the address. That always impresses me. As opposed to the clients who are, will this be in your next book? Will you be able to get Grant and Jason from Taps in here to put on the show? Because you see those people, don't you?
Absolutely, yeah.
And so I think they're both out there. And the nice anonymous cases tend to be the most impressive ones as far as I'm concerned.
So one of the things that always makes me roll my eyes a bit, and I found a place like this in your book, I hope you'll still like me, but I think it's funny, is when investigators will say, the best tool that you can have on an investigation is your brain and a piece of paper. And for real, I want to know, what's your favorite flashy gadget that you use in the field?
Sure. My favorite flashy gadget, I'm liking the REM pod.
Oh, okay.
I'm liking the REM pod right now, and I like it because you can set it down and you can bugger off and you can leave it with a camera on it, and you can cover so much more ground that way. Even the best resourced teams, if you're investigating a fairly large building, nobody seems to have the budget to wire every room with cameras and audio. You can't cover every hallway. I mean, a great example is I just investigated Waverly Hills with my team a few months ago. You could give me $50,000 and I still would not be able to cover half of that building effectively to gather data.
Gosh.
You have to pick and choose. And so the REM pod is a great force multiplier. It helps if you hear a REM pod going off, it's basically hey, let's go investigate this area tool.
Are there any experimental tools or gadgets that you're using? Is the REM pod one of those?
Oh, I think everything in this field is experimental, isn't it?
True.
If I had an unlimited budget, I would just hire Bill Chappell.
Right.
And Bill, make me stuff. Send me one of everything.
Right.
Here's one that makes your tea while investigating EMP. But actually, again, and you're right, I'm not that much of a gadget head. I have folks on my team that are, that have absolutely everything under the sun. And I certainly respect that approach in those tools. You could buy a small house with what some of those guys have actually paid for their equipment. But I genuinely do believe in that thing you just said you didn't like. Look at Conan Doyle, pre-fairies anyway. Look at Sir Oliver Lodge. Look at all of the great paranormal investigators that founded this profession. They did not have gadgets, but what they had was a scientific methodology and a keen mindset, and they were observers. They would look at witness testimony, and they would see if they could poke holes in it. They would see if they could explain what was going on in there. The truth is, you don't need a huge budget to be an effective paranormal investigator. You just need to be able to investigate. And gathering data and measuring the environment and those kind of things are a part of it, but they are by no means the most important part.
And I definitely can't appreciate that statement. It has just always made me laugh that in this day and age with all the technology, that's one of the first things that we always say. But it's fun.
Well, and here's a good question back at you. Do you think we've gotten nearer in the past 100 years to explaining the mysteries of hauntings and ghosts? Are we any closer?
I don't think so. And one thing I was going to say earlier, and I think this is one thing I forgot, is that now that there are more and more and more people in it, and there are more experts, and there are more, like you said, there's less negatives out there for photos and less ways to track things. It's like, who are the experts? So there's now no way to prove anything. Sometimes that's what I think in my head.
I think we should be wary of anyone who claims to be an expert in this field, and that includes me, because what you're getting is a whole bunch of bias and opinion, Whereas the truth is the textbooks aren't out there that you can study for paranormal research. We don't truly understand the phenomena yet. I would argue, actually, that the best people to be regarded as experts in this field would be psychologists, would be physicists, would be medical doctors, psychiatrists, because all of these elements come into play in cases of the paranormal, whether real or not. And I found a number of cases that I've solved by looking at the client's medications list and medical history, Patrick,
Yeah.
I can't help but notice, madam, that you have 3 drugs here whose side effects are hallucinations, including hearing voices. So I think that conventional science definitely plays part of it, but those folks are not conducting investigations, and that's terribly frustrating. The perfect team would have qualified individuals from all of the sciences on it.
And you do, don't you? You have quite a few people of varying backgrounds.
As much as possible, we do. Electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, and qualification doesn't have to come simply with a degree either. As I've said many times, when people apply to join my team, you can tell me that you're a mom of 3, and I consider you bring valuable skills to the table. Because any mom that can get 3 kids out the door in the morning logistically is the person I want wrangling my team. You know what I mean? Skill sets are diverse and varied. And bringing something professional to the table is very nice, though. But it's always kind of amazed me that if you call 911 and you get a fire truck, you expect the people coming off that truck to have a minimum skill set, They should be able to pull hose and break down doors and those kind of things. If you call for an ambulance, you expect an EMT or a paramedic to have a certain skill set. We can all agree on what that is. In fact, there are governing bodies that do it. The same is true of a plumber or of an attorney or of any professional. And yet you go through Google or wherever and you call in a team because your house is haunted. You don't know what you're going to get. There's no standard we all agree on for what constitutes a paranormal investigator or a team. And that's probably why we're not taken as seriously as we should be as a profession.
Well, should you move to Missouri with your team one of these days and you can see the benefit of having a middle school teacher that can multitask and not rock in the corner and suck his thumb with lots of dysfunction going on, let me know, because I can jump on your team too.
I will certainly holler if that proves to be the case.
So I told you before we started today, I have some behind the scenes stuff just because of the nerd that I am that I'm curious about. Can you give us kind of an idea of what your investigation reports look like, how you compile or index data or activity from an investigation, and how do you present your evidence either to the public or to a client?
Well, we can, and you can actually read some of them if you check out our website, bouldercountyparanormal.org.
Awesome.
And they've definitely grown over the years in size. The earliest ones that we put out there were very bare bones and very basic. And one thing that's on my to-do list is to reformat everything so it has a standard format. That's what we're aiming for.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to go to using a format that we use in the medical field called SOAP. SOAP stands for subjective, objective, assessment, and then plan. And what that would mean is that subjective is going to be all the information that the clients and witnesses give you. Anything anybody said that is not objectively verifiable. Because the O, which comes next, is objective.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what we measured. That is anything I could reproduce. That is readings of the EMF. That is readings of air ionization. That is temperature readings. If I could put a number on it, that goes in the objective, you know. If I could measure that you have your structure leaning at a certain angle, or if you have structural problems with the place, as we saw a bunch of at Bobby Mackey's investigating that just a few months ago,
mm-hmm.
that would go in objective. Assessment is the conclusions that we would come to based upon that. So we conclude that airflow is probably what's causing the cold drafts that people are talking about, the fact that the building is not well insulated, you know. So A would be assessment, and then P is plan of investigation. How we're going to use the subjective, the objective, and the assessment to actually get in their boots on the ground and try and get to the bottom of what's going on, your plan of attack. So I'm hoping to move to that SOAP format pretty soon.
I'll be trying to follow that as you put that together. It's very interesting.
Yeah, and it's been my fault as someone that writes a lot of the reports that I tend to write in a very narrative style, narrative-driven.
Mm-hmm.
And the truth is they should all be organized in the same way, and that's one of my great failings as a documenter in this field. You know, one report should look very much like another in terms of the way it's laid out.
So more behind the scenes, I know what putting a team together looked like for me. I was typing up handbooks and doing research and reading and making forms and contracts, and I really nerded out on that stuff. What did that process look like for you early on?
Putting the team together initially?
Yeah.
The main thing was looking for like-minded professionals with a similar philosophy. And so the vetting process as to whether someone would be a good fit for the team was and remains, I think, the hardest part. Because most folks that applied and that do apply for us do not lack enthusiasm, which is a good thing. But you need a good fit for your philosophy. There are teams out there I saw that are very, very, very skeptical and will set out to debunk everything. They'll walk into a property with the belief already in their minds that this place cannot be haunted. In fact, I know of one team in the Denver metro area I'm not going to name, but they basically go in on the assumption that this stuff doesn't happen because it cannot happen. So you kind of want to steer away from that mentality, but also you don't want to be too credulous. You don't want the folks coming in, and this happens quite often, that say, you know, oh, I see dead people everywhere all the time. I've always been able to communicate with spirit because I'm very, very special. And yet they'll go on and deliver absolutely no verifiable information at all.
Mm-hmm.
And my stance on sensitive, psychics, mediums, whatever, has always been the same. It has always been, I am very ready to be impressed. I will give you your shot. And it happens so far, at least, that I've not had one person deliver a piece of information to me that could not have been attained via Google. You know? So I'm still waiting for that zinger. If folks say that they have those abilities, we'll always give them a chance. But we're looking for that mix of a team that is kind of in the middle, you know. we're ready to be convinced, but you are going to have to convince us. And when I say you, I mean the evidence. So putting the team of like-minded individuals together like that, I think, was the biggest challenge. And that's why our team's relatively small. We have only around about 10 members at any given moment.
As we're getting right into the middle of October, my favorite month, what are your thoughts on certain months out of the year being more conducive to paranormal activity? Does the veil between the living and the dead truly get lifted during this time? Do you take stock in any of that?
That's the traditional explanation, isn't it? And it's a very poetic one. The veil between worlds get thinner.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's undeniable that there are more ghost sightings and paranormal activity reported in the run-up to Halloween than any other time of the year. But I suspect the explanation is more prosaic than that. It's more mundane. I think that ghosts are on our mind, and they're on everybody's mind. I mean, the reason that my publisher, Llewellyn, brought In Search of the Paranormal out in September is because that's the period where these kind of books, September, October, November, tend to sell the best.
Absolutely.
They don't tend to sell well on bright, sunny days in June because people's minds are on, hiking and camping and the beach and whatever. But all of our thoughts as the nights draw in, we start turning towards the ghostly and the supernatural, and the trees become more skeletal, don't they? And we see the leaves blowing, and it just looks like everywhere is part of a haunted house story. And so more people are thinking about ghosts, and that's why I think more people either genuinely or mistakenly experience this activity in the run-up to Halloween.
So this has become kind of a tradition. It's probably the most important question of the day. Outside of the paranormal, outside of your heroic work with being a volunteer fireman, and what kind of nerd are you?
I am a massive, epic Star Wars nerd. And I'm counting the days to episode 7 like you would not believe. I just spent a week's pay on all of the episode 7 Lego.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I'm a Star Wars nerd. I'm a huge Star Trek fan also. I'm a huge fan of all of that kind of geek genre stuff. And the thing is, too, I've never understood the whole Star Wars, Star Trek versus, are you a Marvel or a DC? I think there are so many cool universes out there right now. We are living, and don't get me started on this, Patrick, but we're living in a golden age of geekdom. I was a fan, and I've been going to sci-fi conventions since 1987.
Mm-hmm.
And I came through what I think of as the wilderness years, when Doctor Who was not on TV, when Star Trek was not that popular on TV, and indeed before Next Generation, when it just wasn't on TV at all, for the most part, when the superhero movies didn't exist, Marvel Studios didn't exist, and we were laughed at for being geeks. And now, boy, have we taken over, right?
Yeah.
You look at Marvel ruling the box office, DC ruling TV, Star Trek is back at the movies and it's great. Star Wars is coming back and it's going to be massive and fantastic. Doctor Who is superb again. And we're just living in this golden age. And just walk through any store like Target and look around and you are seeing Marvel characters, DC characters, all of the new Star Wars characters. It's just a great time to be a geek.
So you mentioned some of the fiction you write. Why don't you tell us about that and then move right into you plugging away and telling us where we can find all of your work and flock to buy the book we're talking about today?
You bet. So I write basically an even split between fact and fiction-based books. The novels I write is a series called Wellington Undead. It's about the Duke of Wellington, who happens to be a vampire, which is kind of tough when you're a general because you have to fight all of your major engagements at night. But it looks at how that would have been, and it's basically the supernatural werewolves, vampires, zombies, as my current book is about. Had that all been real, how would that have worked in a historical setting? And I also write a series of novels called the Dead Seer books, which is about a teenage boy, a 14-year-old boy, who is gifted with the ability to communicate with the dead, and therefore goes to some very haunted locations and ends up getting into all kinds of scrapes. And the new novel in that series, Agonal Breath, just came out last week, set in an old abandoned sanatorium in the Rocky Mountains. And you can find information about all of my books at my website, richardestep.net. And I would love for your listeners to come along, say hi, shoot me an email, because I just love conversing with people that are into the same kind of stuff as I am.
And I'll definitely have all of those links in the show notes if you go to bigseance.com, and you can check out those there. Sir, you have a lot of responsibilities and you keep very busy, and I want to thank you for giving us some of your time. It's been a fun conversation. I really appreciate it. You rock.
Thanks, Patrick. I've loved being on the Big Seance. You have a very cool show, and I love your approach.
Thank you. For show notes, including links to anything we may have mentioned in this episode, visit bigseance.com, now the home of both the blog and the podcast. Just click on the Big Seance Podcast logo or find it in the menu. You can also find and subscribe to the show on iTunes and Stitcher. Do you have any comments or feedback? Please contact me at patrick@bigseance.com. You can call my feedback line at 7755-TELL-ME. That's 775-583-5563. You can also record audio feedback right from the site using the SpeakPipe link included in the show notes. I could decide to include your voice in a future show. Thank you so much for listening and reading. Unfortunately, it's time to blow the candles out, but we'll see you and light them again next time. Okay, so here we go. If you made it all the way to the end of this episode, tweet me with the hashtag Boulder County, and my handle is @BigSeance. Hashtag Boulder County. See ya.